Are you feeling depressed because your sub bass sounds as flat as Kim Kardashian with no money?
Why would you say that?
Have you realized that maybe your 808s don't hit as hard as Dad used to? Well, hold up there, cowboy. Don't give up on your dreams just yet, because in this video, I've got 5 juicy tips to make your sub basses sound amazing. So the first thing you're gonna do, you stupid little dickhead, is open up FabFilter Pro Q, and then you're gonna put a low cut on there. Now we usually want to cut around 20 to 40 hertz. Now the reason for this is because most headphones and studio monitors can't produce below around 50 hertz. This removes all the unwanted muddiness and makes the bass a lot cleaner in your mix. If you didn't put that cut in and you played it through a club system, it would sound rumbly and awful. So do it, you big Nancy. Alright, I've had my fun with that voice. Let's just go back to normal, eh? So I usually go for a low shelf from about 100 hertz and I boost it around 3 to 5 decibels. Now a lot of people will tell you not to go for a low shelf, but fuck them, it sounds good. Now here's where you want to be careful, because your headphones might overproduce the bass and so might your monitors. So it's always good to check your mix through a subwoofer or something that can accurately respond to bass. So when boosting this area, just be cautious of how much you boost it by, otherwise you might end up having a really powerful sub bass. The next EQ trick you can use is pretty good if you want more mid-range in your bass and you want it to sit better in stuff like phone speakers and car stereo systems. So in FabFilter, when you play the bass, you can actually hold the spectrum here and it'll bring up the fundamental frequency. If you don't have FabFilter, don't worry, the fundamental frequency is just the biggest bump in your bass. And as we can see, that's 43 hertz. What we're gonna do is we're gonna experiment with putting different EQ points at different harmonics. Now to find your second harmonic, all you do is double the fundamental frequency, which is 43 hertz. So I've found all the harmonics here. If we listen to 80 doesn't sound very good. Sounds horrible, too much. Don't like it, so we're going to get rid of that. But if we listen to the 122, we've got a nice ring tone. If we mix the two together, you're going to get a nice raspy sound. Now I've boosted these quite a lot, but you wouldn't usually do it this harshly. I've boosted it that much so you can hear the difference in boosting the harmonic overtones. It's definitely something worth trying out in your mixing session. Don't be too scared to boost it as much as you think is necessary, because your ears are always the best tool when producing. Do what sounds good and works. Let's move on to tip number 2, and tip number 2 is to choose the best notes and the best scale for your sub bass before even writing it, because it does make a massive difference. I don't know if you've ever been slapping your dick on the notes on the keyboard and you've heard that the different bass notes sound very different to each other. Some sound a lot more fat and big and juicy, and some just sound like your old grandma, 90-year-old grandma's just let out a fart. Let me explain. So over in Ableton, we've got a G1, and as you can see over here, this is in the good range of the sub bass. So it's going to be bouncing around the 49 hertz of the fundamental frequency in your spectrum. This is good because this is where a lot of the body of the sub bass is, and it's a lot of where that is that you want to come through in your sub bass. Let's take a listen. Sounds very nice, juicy. It sounds like your ears are about to explode, which is what we want. Now, if I take that down to the C1 that you can see over there on my nice, pretty graphic, which, by the way, you can go get over at www.whippedcreamsounds.com, where ASMR sounds are not what we do for a living, but we commonly get mistaken for ASMR sounds. So let's take a look. I've taken that down to a C1, and if you have a listen, you'll understand what I mean. It sounds alright at C1. It sounds just passable at C1, but it just sounds too rumbly and horrible. If we go right below C1, we go down to like an A0. Man, you do not want that to have happening in your track. So it's very important to stay within a range of sub notes that is in this range. So you want to go usually D sharp 1, to around B1. Anything above that B1 is commonly a bit too high to where we want the frequency spectrum bouncing around to get that really juicy, nice sub bass. So, when writing your sub bass, take into account the scale you're using. If you're using C major, try and avoid the C1 note, because the C1 note sounds alright, but it just doesn't really give the same clarity as the notes in between D sharp 1 and the B1. Which brings me on to my next tip. And that next tip, my friends, is use compression. So we're gonna go drop it like it's hot. So most producers get scared of compressors because they don't really understand what they do. It's like some kind of mystical dark art for the beginners. I know when I was first starting out, compression was very confusing to me. So if you don't know what a compressor does, all it does is squash your audio. It takes the high peaks and the low peaks of the amplitude of your signal and squashes them together and reduces the amount of dynamic range, which basically reduces the amount of volume difference that your audio has. It makes it more of a sausage shape than a beautiful dynamic curvy audio file. If you do need to clean up a little bit more on your compressor knowledge, go down into the description box below, hit the link to the What is Compression article, and it will explain everything for you. Compressing your bass can be really useful when you want it to sound thicker. So this sounds really thick already, but if we want it to sound thicker and more uniform than it already is, let's go ahead and dial in some compression. I'm going to turn the makeup off and I'm just going to dial in some compression here. I'm going for about a 4:1 ratio to start with. That's usually my starting point for bass compression. You don't want it too harsh, but you don't want it too little as well. It's not a soft compression, and you want to go for a soft knee usually. So we're going to go ahead and turn that knee down a little bit as well, because we've got a long bass note here. If you're using a more percussive bass note sound like an 808 or something like a deep house bass, then you'll probably want to go for a harder knee and more harsh compression to just bring it out and make it stand out a little bit more and make it thicker and more impactful. So for the attack, I'm basically going to go for a start of around 100 milliseconds, right about there. And what we're going to do is we're going to listen to this bass and we're just going to dial back the attack a bit until we hear the transient being destroyed. Once we can hear the transient being destroyed, we can then push the attack a little bit further forward and then allow that transient to come through and allow the compression to react after that transient is hit, rather than squashing the dynamics of the transient. See if you can hear the difference here between 100 and 50. Yeah, so it sounded a lot better. About 147 is what I had there. That was very nice. Once we've done the attack, we're going to go ahead and dial in the release. And the release is something a lot of people struggle with as well. It's something I struggled with before, but use this simple tip and you'll never struggle with it again. Okay, so I've just drawn in a couple of notes so we can hear the release actually reacting between the notes. And right now we have a 50 millisecond release. So I'm going to pop that up to about 100 just to see what it sounds like. Sounds like it's destroying that transient a bit too much. It is compressing it too much over in the next note. So we're going to dial back that release a bit. "63 milliseconds sounds good to me. It allows the compressor to get back to 0 before we hit the next note, and that is what the release is going to be doing. The last thing you want to do with compression is you want to put the output gain up by the amount you have reduced the gain. So as you can see, we got this lovely gain reduction meter here, and it's going to show us roughly how much gain we have actually removed from the signal, and we can just sort of ballpark it here. You don't want to go above the amount of gain that you have reduced from this signal, and you just want to push it up a slight amount. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push it up, I'm going to A/B it, I'm going to turn it on and off until I hear no difference in the sound rather than the thickness. So when I A/B test it, you'll be able to hear that there is no difference in the volume, but you'll be able to hear that there's a difference in the thickness of the sound, which is what we want. We don't want to add volume, because when you add volume, your mind already perceives the added volume as better, because we hear louder things is better. That's how our brains and ears work. By compressing the bass, we can up this perceived loudness and thickness of the bass without actually increasing the volume, which is what we want. Now, the next tip with compression is sidechain compression, and you're going to want to use this when you've got a kick and a bass in there. We're also going to go over parallel compression after this as well, which is really useful for this type of bass I've got, which I'm going to play to you now. So as you can hear, we got quite a subby sound, and when we bring that kick in, we're going to hear a lot of clashing because they occupy the same frequency range. As you can hear there, they're fighting for a lot of space with each other, and that's because they occupy the same low-end frequencies. Now, to get around this, one way that I would use is I would grab a compressor and I would put the sidechain compression on. I'd go infinite to 1, and then I'd put the sidechain on the kick, wherever that is. What did I call it? There. I bring the threshold down and I just start listening to it. And as you can hear there, just adding the sidechain compression has already cleaned up that low end. Now, a lot of people will tell you to choose either the bass or the kick and carve out one of the low end frequencies of this. I'm going to tell you to ignore that if you're making dance music, because that is a load of bullshit. I listened to that advice for a number of years, and it's always why my tracks sounded so thin and shit in the low end. If you're making house music or something like that, you don't want to choose one of them. You commonly want both of them hitting in at the same time. You want the kick to occupy that same frequency and the bass to rumble in that same frequency in a kind of synergy together, rather than one does the one's job and the other does the other's job. It just doesn't work. So to get this, I use sidechain compression, and that is all you really need to do. With a little tiny bit of clever EQ and sidechain compression, you can create this effect of the synergy of the bass and the kick moving together. The next step would be to group the bass and the kick together and compress the bass and the kick as one element, so they're kind of glued. I'm not going to go into that in this video because you can literally just select it all, shift and G to create a group, and then chuck a glue compressor on it, and you've basically got the effect. The next cool tip to get your bass to stand out is parallel compression, and parallel compression is exceptionally good for percussive sounds that you want to stab people in the kidneys with. Parallel compression is basically two compressors, one on one channel and one on the other channel. You can set it up really easily in Ableton using an audio effect rack, but if you want to do it in any other DAW, you basically just send your entire bass to another bus and you will chuck a compressor on the bus you sent it to, which was send A. So I chuck a compressor on send A. With this compressor, you really want to go for very, very, very heavy compression and very kind of short, snappy compression. Using this short, snappy compression will add a kind of gritty underlying texture on this send that you can then mix and blend like the bad boy selector you are back into your original bass sound. So I'm just going to dial in some settings here on the send, and I'll come back when I've done it. So for this, I specifically like to use the Waves API 2500 compressor. It is the best compressor for parallel compression in my opinion, and adds the greatest amount of smack. You can do it with the glue compressor or the normal compressor in Ableton as well, but it's just not as good. So I've dialed in some settings, and what you really want to be listening for is that smash. You'll hear it like crushing and squashing. So let's take a listen. Now, if we were to add that back in with the original bass and do a little bit of mixing with it, you'd be able to hear a massive difference. So if we hear it without, it just brings that underlying gritty layer that makes the bass stand out. Now you can go a little bit further with this, and you can add saturation and stuff on this channel as well. So you could add some distortion and some saturation, put it on the bus and blend it in as well, and you're going to get a much better result that stands out in the mix. But parallel compression is a great place to start. It just really gives it a nice little lift, and as well as the sidechain compression gives it that space to breathe within the mix. Once you've added saturation, reverb, distortion, all that other good stuff, you're gonna get a wicked sounding bass. Which brings me on to saturation and distortion. You want to distort and saturate your bass to make it sound wicked. So we're gonna go over that here now, and I'm gonna use a saturator. Now I always usually put the saturator before the compressor, so we're gonna do that. Now as you can see, I've dialed in a couple saturation settings. I've put a medium curve on, I've put the drive up to 7.43 decibels, and I've taken the output down so we don't add any gain in our signal. And then I've also taken the dry wet down as well, because if it sounds full up, it sounds horrible. So you can hear what that's doing. It's adding extra harmonics to the sound and just bringing out a nice distortion tone. Now, if we dial that back to around 20%, it just gives it a nice little lift. Yeah, it just sounds that extra little bit gritty and beautiful, and it's gonna punch through the mix and sound so good. You wanna go a bit further as well, you can add some amp simulation in here, and you can also try a little bit of erosion. I really love erosion on 808 bass in particular. It just adds that extra kind of like height to the sound, the air that you want that is missing from your bass. So let's go through erosion, and we're just gonna add a little bit of erosion after the saturator. And I usually add a tiny bit of noise, but you can also add a sine one as well. But if we have a listen to how it sounds with the noise. It just brings it out in the top end a little bit more, makes it nice and a little bit crispier. So let's hear it with everything off. Yeah, just adds a little bit more grit to it, a little bit more presence, a little bit more rumble in the bass, and it's nice. You can do this with any type of sub bass, long notes, percussive notes, 808s. Particularly what works very well on 808s is saturation and erosion. On long notes, I like to use a saturator and a glue compressor, and I like to turn on the little soft clip option on the glue compressor and just give it a little bit of an analog distortion. With the more percussive stuff, I'll use parallel compression, and I'll also use compression and saturation as well, but I won't use parallel compression on long notes. The next thing you can do to make your sub bass sound better, especially on laptop speakers and shit speakers like phones and what everybody listens to music on. I know you've spent hours in your £5,000 studio wanking over your mix at how it sounds with foam around you and all that lovely padded insanity stuff. But in reality, someone's listening to that on Apple earbuds or something they've got from fucking Poundland. So how do you get it sounding good through that? Well, the reality of the matter is that these speakers do not produce the low-end magic that you want people to hear. So you need to somehow get that low-end magic to be reproduced on these speakers. You can add this information through using saturation, but honestly, I much prefer doubling the octave. It's easier and it always provides a much cleaner result. Now, how do you double the octave? You simply go over to your bass, that is the sub part of the bass, which is BA Tokyo, I think here. So we're gonna go over to this one, and then we're basically gonna pop this in a group. We're gonna go over to the chain, we're gonna duplicate the chain, and then we're gonna go over to MIDI effects, and we're gonna grab the +12 pitch and pop it on the other one. Now, if you don't have Ableton, then you're a fucking loser and you should get it. But if you still want to be a loser, then all you really need to do is duplicate the track and just basically select all the MIDI and go up an octave. But anyway, in the Ableton Master Race version, we've got the low and the high chain here. The high chain has the pitch on it. And then what you're going to do is you're going to go over to the audio effect and you're going to grab an EQ, place that bad boy after the high, and you're just going to remove that 50 hertz range because it's already been covered by the low range here, because otherwise it might get a little bit muddy, and sometimes it does. Okay, so I was listening, and in this case, it wasn't +12, it was +24 that added this extra information for me. So as we can hear now, we're adding a lot of that 200 to 300 hertz range that you'll find on laptop speakers and phone speakers where the bass really sings through. Then what you want to do is you want to mix this in low, so you want to go take it down a notch. And you just want to hear that subtly. It just gives the bass so much more beautiful harmonic information that's gonna sound amazing.
Which brings me on to the last tip.
You want to sit there and you want to listen to your mix through terrible speakers. Commonly, you'll find in very expensive studios, they actually purposely buy shit speakers called Aventone speakers. You want to listen to your music through shitty speakers. And when I stress this, you want to listen to it in mono shitty speakers. So stuff like laptop speakers, stuff like iPhone speakers. The HomePod's really good. It's not a shit speaker, but it's mono, so it's good to check your bass and to check your mix in a kind of home surround system. Or Alexa as well, or Google Home, or anything like that. They're all mono. You'll also want to check your mix in the car as well, just common things that people listen to them on, because you'll be able to pick things up. So borrow some devices from around your home. Ask your friend if you can go sit in his car for a bit. Go do a bank robbery, whatever you need to do to get your track good. Remember when I said that tip about doubling the octave and the saturation, bringing through those harmonics? If you sit in the car and you listen without the double the octave, and then you take another mix there and you put the double the octave in that version, and you play them one after the other, you will hear a massive difference in the feeling of the bass you can get out of the car speakers. Listen to your mix, then listen to a reference track, compare the two and see what's really lacking. Go back to the studio and really think, what is lacking? Is it the low mids? Is it the sub is way too loud? Is it that the high end is terrible as well? Really hone in and listen to that feature, and then go back in the studio and use these techniques. Double the octave if you can't hear your bass properly in a car speaker or a mono speaker like an iPhone speaker or a laptop speaker. If the sub is way too loud, reduce your EQ and go back in and turn the sub bass down. If the kick and the bass sound muddy and they sound like they're fighting for space, then you want to go back in and you want to kind of compress the bass and the kick together, maybe add a little bit more sidechain and a little bit more EQ magic. And my voice just cracked like I'm a 14-year-old going through teenage puberty, so I think that's about it for today, guys. Try these mix tips out, but remember that your ears are always the best tool. I know I sound like a financial advisor trying to cover his ass when I say that type of stuff, but that is really the end goal here. You want to train your ears to listen to things and to make adjustments using your beautiful ears. If this did help you out, go down, turn that like button a crisp shade of blue, or don't. Let me know that it was shit if you thought it was shit. While you're down there, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, and I will see you in the next episode. Da 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 da. It's the motherfucking whipped cream sound. Snoop Dogg. Da 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 da. It's the motherfucking whipped cream sounds. Woo, woo. All right, I'm done. Bye.